When we're asked to almost speak to or denote what we would say our religious identity was, gone are the days where most people across the UK would tick a box to say that they're a Christian. So whilst we do actually have that raft of the 6% of people, which hasn't changed actually dramatically over the decades, the church, if you like, has remained pretty static. So that's quite good news for us, not that the media told us that. But my understanding is that actually there's a broader understanding, a broader sense of what people would say of themselves, whether they're atheists, whether they're non-practicing and so on.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
I am delighted to be joined by Rachael Heffer, Head of Mission for the Evangelical Alliance, and we're going to be looking at some research about the state of faith in the UK. Now, the original Talking Jesus report came out back in 2015 and further research was undertaken in 2022. I'm going to be talking to Rachael about some of the key findings in this research and whether there were any significant differences between the 2015 report and the 2022 report. We're obviously now in 2024, so I also want to know if any of these insights are still relevant to us today. And I suppose after 2 years of reflecting on this research, has anything changed? What have they learnt? And how can we put some of this knowledge into practice? Rachael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Ruth.
Rachael, the main focus of this show is obviously going to be around the Talking Jesus research, but would you just share a little bit about your own journey and why you're so passionate about this stuff?
Sure, great question. Thanks. I'd love to share a little bit about my own journey with you. My current situation is I'm married to Darren. I live in Ely in Cambridgeshire. We have 2 boys who are 12 and 15, fast outgrowing me, much taller. I go to a church here in Ely that I've been part of for 20 years or so. My background is I grew up in Leicester, very multicultural, became a Christian through a church-based holiday club at the age of 7, and being part of an Anglican church back then, I was confirmed at the age of 14. And that for me was a real marker in the sand of a kind of, thanks mum and dad, thanks to my church upbringing, but this was really something that I wanted to grab hold of and believe for myself. So as I look back, both at age 7 and 14, I suppose, in terms of faith development, those were 2 markers. I did a language degree, and I've said to many young people that I've worked with over the years, it's good to plan your way, isn't it? But hold plans very lightly, because having done a language degree, I've never ended up using it as part of my career journey. But I loved it. I loved people, culture, and the languages at the time. But the route that God took me on was working through Youth for Christ for many years, 14 years, in fact, both locally and nationally. And I guess that bred a real heart for not only the UK church, of course, young people, but people of all ages, but really about how we can actually live alongside people in friendship, in great relationships, but share Jesus with them. So there's lots of elements of my own faith journey that I won't bore you with, but really, I guess over the years, it's birthed just that sense of really acknowledging what God's done in my life, loving my friends, loving, all the fun times that we have, but in the midst of the challenges of life, let's say, really wanting them to know Jesus too. So part of that has led me to where I am today and my work at the EA. And as you said, all of this research and speaking to that over the last couple of years.
Rachael, before we go into the research, I'd love to just ask, how did you end up going to that youth camp in the first place?
The youth camp was way back at the age of 7. That was actually a church-based holiday club. It's quite simple, isn't it? Many of the churches in our communities would do that kind of thing. And probably as leaders, we often underestimate actually how those can be so impactful, not just for the fun and the community and all of those good things, but actually where it has that Christian distinctiveness, how impactful they can be for children, even at a very young age. So I'm really passionate now, actually, at looking at all the work we do through the EA as well, even with toddler groups, with children's ministry, with youth ministry, just acknowledging that actually, when people come together and they feed in all the fun and the faith elements, that actually it can really take root as it did in my life. So that, I guess, came out of a church-based scenario, parents and so on. But what it led on to was me actually going on to summer-based holiday clubs as well, and camps, and running them for 7 years myself, being passionate about investing, again, in children and young people myself. So, yeah.
Rachel, before we dive into some of the sort of nitty-gritty details of the research, would you give us maybe a little bit of the background, like why was the research conducted, who did you speak to, and if you could perhaps define some of the terms that were used for particular groups within the report, that'd be really helpful as well.
Sure, absolutely. So as you've mentioned already, the 2022 research was not the original piece of research. It came out the first time around, as you've said, way back in 2015. And where that came from was a bunch of leaders who were part of a group that was called the Denominational Leaders Summit. So these were basically leaders who were heads of networks, heads of denominations, heads of churches, who came together to say at a certain point in time, 2014-15, so wouldn't it be great if, rather than just anecdotally and through stories, wouldn't it be great if we had a credible piece of research that could actually really map the UK landscape in terms of evangelism? So what they wanted to find out was what non-Christians would say in their own reflections of the Christians that they knew, but also the church and of Jesus himself. And then we also wanted to know from a raft of practicing Christians what their reflections were of actually sharing faith and witnessing themselves. So way back in 2015, a bit of money was thrown into the pot. We went to a credible national body of researchers called Savanta Comres, and the research was conducted. And basically what came out of that was a piece of research that was so overridingly positive that those denominational leaders and heads of networks didn't believe it. So what happened at the time was a bit more money was gathered together, and worth saying the partnership originally for the research was ourselves at the EA, it was along with Hope Together and the Church of England. And so when we went back to Savanta Comres with that bit more money, asked them to scratch a little bit deeper, again, what came back was so overridingly encouraging that actually what it went on to do was to really help many church networks, many church leaders shape their evangelism strategies and the vision in their churches around it. So the dream was always that after we launched the research back in 2015, the Talking Jesus course, which many churches have used to, again, give confidence, I guess, in faith sharing. The dream was always that we'd redo the research 5 years on. But of course, 2015, add 5, 2020, in comes a global pandemic. Not the best time to conduct a piece of research. But to bring that up to today, or 2022 when we launched it, basically what emerged was over between 2020 and onwards, numerous people started asking the questions, how has COVID shaped things? How has it impacted the church? How has it affected our witness and so on? And so we decided to go again in 2021-22 with this piece of research. So suffice to say, where that leads us to when it came out is now a 6-way partnership, which is the Talking Jesus research, as you flagged up, which looks like this, is a partnership between, again, ourselves at the EA, of Hope Together, Alpha, Kingsgate, the network denomination, CV Global, and our friends at the Louis Plough Association. In terms of definition, just broadly, probably one of the main ones worth flagging is, as I mentioned, our practicing Christians. So this research was carried out in January 2022, 4,000 adults across the UK, but with a boost sample of over 900 practicing Christians. And that is people who would say that they go to church at least monthly and would say that they read the Bible and pray at least weekly. So that's important for us to know in the mix as well.
Yeah, and I guess the other categories, just to say, are non-Christians, non-practicing Christians, no religion and other faiths, aren't they? I mean, one of the things that really struck me in the 2022 report, 48% of the population described themselves as Christians compared to 58% in 2015. And among the youngest generation, the 18 to 24s, only 29 described themselves as Christians. I mean, why do you think there has been such a significant drop in the number of people who are now choosing to affiliate themselves with the Christian faith? And I guess, why do you think that's particularly the case among the younger generations, Rachel?
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There has been this sort of shift, if you like. And you might recall as well, the national census came out. And again, the headline that shot out there was about, the first time in 50 years that the percentage had dropped below 50%. Which, again, as ever, the media often seems to be quite negative, quite bad news, isn't it? But my understanding was, well, not only was that not a surprise to us, because as you've said, the Talking Jesus research has already told us that the breakdown of that, the 48% that you mentioned, was that 42% of people across the UK would say that they'd tick a box to align their own religious identity to be a non-practicing Christian. 6% of people said they were practicing Christians. So it gives us a good sized team, if you like, not nearly as big as we'd love it to be. But in answer to your question as to why the drop, my belief is, and again in looking at the census as well, and particularly those in the younger generations, as you said, is that actually when we're asked to almost speak to or denote what we would say our religious identity was, gone are the days where most people across the UK would tick a box to say that they're a Christian. So whilst we do actually have that raft of the 6% of people, which hasn't changed actually dramatically over the decades, the church, if you like, has remained pretty static. So that's quite good news for us. Not that the media told us that, but my understanding is that actually there's a broader understanding, a broader sense of what people would say of themselves, whether they're atheists, whether they're non-practicing and so on. So the younger generations, what we're finding is if they are practicing Christians, if they're sold out, church attending, spirit-filled Christians, they'll absolutely tick the box of practicing Christian. But most people across all generations would not necessarily now tick that box if they were a nominal Christian. So that's the challenge that we have. But there's been that shift in a cultural affiliation, if you like, that shows itself in the research too.
And we have also seen a rise of the nuns, haven't we? The people that will tick non for. I mean, would you just say a little bit about who the nuns are and whether this is noteworthy as well?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely noteworthy, isn't it? And many colleagues across the Christian world have done lots of digging deeper into that. So who are these people? And again, I'm not sure I can define that absolutely, but they are people, aren't they, who would say, actually just don't have any affiliate, wouldn't say that they're Christian, wouldn't say that they're atheist, but they still have lots of questions. For me, one of the most interesting things that has come out of that, again, some of the context and some of the research findings, is that digging a little bit deeper into, okay, well, if they wouldn't say that they would affiliate to a faith, how would they speak of themselves? And moreover, I guess, where I've seen research being done, and we ourselves at the EA and wider, again, interested is, you know, when we've asked them what are some of the questions that they're asking, what are they engaged with, what do they sort of look at in terms of their own spirituality? Actually, there's still a lot of questions that we don't know, but we're digging deeper into some of that to find out if it's not some of the age-old apologetics questions that people are asking. Is there a God? Why does God allow suffering? Then what are some of the questions that the nuns, if you like, are actually asking and seeking after? So yeah, whilst this research speaks to lots of answers, there still begs lots of questions as well, which can only be a positive to help our understanding.
Well, let's dive a little bit, if you don't mind, into some of those questions, because I think lots of people seem to suggest that young people in particular aren't really asking questions about faith or God or meaning, or as you say, you know, there's been some research that suggests that they're perhaps not answering those sort of more traditional apologetics questions. I mean, does that resonate with your research, or do you think they are asking questions still, I guess particularly the younger generation?
I think my short answer would be yes, absolutely. I think people of all ages always, eternally will ask questions, won't they? What I guess we're finding is, in fact, one of the questions in the report, in the Talking Jesus research, was if there was any question that was kind of your burning question at the moment, what would it be? And we gave them a raft of options. What we found was that the top answer was none of the above, which again begs that question we've just spoken to of, okay, as Christians, as the church, we really need to be understanding what some of the big cultural or personal questions are that people are asking. But the answer that came out overridingly was the top answer at 19% of the UK said that they're asking, will everything be okay? Closely followed by what will make me happy. Third answer was what happens when you die. And there were a raft of other questions. But isn't that interesting that overridingly, and particularly in the younger age bracket, so our young people, young adults particularly, are asking this question of will everything be okay? So against that cultural backdrop that you and I will both be all too aware of, you know, contested culture, lots of the big questions, lots of mental health, anxiety and so on, it does seem that actually maybe not some of the age-old apologetics question, but the questions like, why am I here? What's my purpose? How do I cope? Will everything be okay? Against the backdrop, again, of not only what we've all been through over the last 5 years, but the cost of living crisis, challenges for the future. Those, particularly amongst our young adults, seem to be quite prevalent at the moment. That will everything be okay? How do I make sense of it all? How do I cope with what's being thrown at me in this perma-crisis, if you like, of all that we've been through, but all that we continue to deal with?
And I thought this was really interesting as well. You asked where non-Christians, and obviously you've defined a little bit what that means, would go to find out about the Christian faith. I mean, what were some of those answers? And I guess crucially, how should this impact the way that practicing Christians, as you've defined, are trying to engage with some of the people around us that don't have any faith?
Yeah, so one of the key questions in the research was, if you were even starting to explore faith, the Christian faith, where would you go? And what we found was, maybe unsurprisingly, I don't know about you, Ruth, but if I want to find out anything, I probably go to Google first. And the top answer was 26% of the UK said that they would first go to Google to explore faith. It was closely followed by a further 10% who said that they would look on YouTube. So it's really noteworthy for us that 36% of those that we surveyed across the UK said that they would actually go to the digital presence first to explore faith. Again, I don't know what you'd make of that. For me, what that speaks to is this kind of safety factor, almost the anonymity of being able to go online to ask maybe some of those big hitter questions. Why are we here? How do I become Christian? Is there a God? Maybe some of those things. But as we've been speaking to this research with church leaders, with denominations, conferences and so on, one of my encouragements to people has been, on every level of the digital, actually, what that speaks to us about is actually using our organisational websites, our church websites, even our own social media, to actually not just be speaking about the programmes that we run or the services or the events that we're putting on, but actually be really mindful that people might come to us to be looking at some of those big questions as well. So that was the top answer, and I've challenged myself to actually be a bit bolder and braver with my own social media as well during the course of the year, because you just don't know, do you, who's looking and who might grasp something of light and hope and faith through the digital. Worth saying, the joint second top answer was as follows. 22% of the UK said that if they wanted to explore faith, they would go along to a local church. Again, that's encouraging, isn't it, for church leaders? Deeply challenging, maybe, that actually, again, from my own experience of talking to lots of people over the last year, it's been interesting that particularly amongst young adults, they actually seek out an open church building and somebody to speak to answer some of those questions. A colleague of mine said that she came to faith from a Hindu background, and she, for 10 months, midweek this was, not the weekend, but for 10 months tried to find a church building that was open so that she could actually explore faith a bit further and find somebody to answer her questions. So some big challenges there for us, but really good news that people will and do recognise a local church for being the place to explore faith. And lastly, probably I'd pull out of that, again, what was the joint second top answer, as I mentioned, was 22% of people equally said that they would go to the Bible first to explore faith. Now, I've had many church leaders and otherwise say to me, Rachel, is it a bad thing that it actually really surprises me that answer was quite so high? My response has been, no, that's not a bad thing. But isn't it a really timely reminder for us as Christians, as friends, as family members, to actually recognise the really transformative power of the Word of God as people are looking to explore faith? So there's lots of other answers, but I think those are three of the big hitters that hopefully could be really interesting, insightful and transformational in how we go about sharing faith with those in our communities.
Rachel, I guess those statistics highlight the method that people would use if they did want to find out about the Christian faith. But I guess taking a step back from that, are people actually interested in finding out about God? Because I suppose the rise of the nuns might potentially give the impression that there isn't much of an appetite for that sort of thing. What do you think about that?
My reading of the culture of the society that we're in, and certainly through many conversations, is that yes, absolutely. I think there is an openness amongst most people. Of course, we're always going to come across people who might want to shut down any conversation about faith. And of course, we have to respect that entirely. We don't know people's stories or their backdrops, do we? And we can prayerfully, part ways or look to engage at other times in other places of conversations of value. My own understanding and what I see, again, both in the national context, but also in my own personal context with peers, with still doing a lot of youth ministry with young people, is that people are absolutely open to exploring some of those big questions, but also just, the backdrop as to the purpose of life, and how to cope in it all. As we said earlier, I think we are living in deeply challenging times, aren't we? Whether that's with what we've been through, whether we're younger, whether we're older, all of the unsettled nature of what we've all lived through over the last 4 or 5 years, and indeed looking ahead, the uncertainty of futures, of education, of finance, whatever it may be, and even people of an older age as well, asking some of those questions of, how do I make sense of things? So I absolutely think there is an openness. I think ours is the job, isn't it, to be discerning of actually just where those open elements might come in conversation. I think part of my own background was looking back to when I was even a teenager and growing up in the church, was we were often encouraged to seize that moment if we saw that people were asking a question and tell them the whole gospel. My personal feeling, and I think what comes out of the research, is that actually, whilst we're absolutely called as Christian witnesses to have an answer for the hope that we profess to, sometimes seizing that moment and telling them all too much maybe can be detrimental. But actually living alongside people who are asking those questions, who are seeking how to cope with some of the stresses and the turmoil of life, but to just be discerning and prayerful as to how to input those little nuggets of something, that little essence of God's story that might just connect with them in those moments. That's ours to be discerning of, and to be genuinely prayerful in the background and see people gently make steps to open up those conversations and maybe that exploration of faith and of God. I think that's where the transformative power potentially over maybe the long term as well might actually commence. But I think people are definitely asking those questions. Again, as we said, we just need to know what those questions are.
Rachel, you mentioned at the beginning that people were sort of overwhelmingly surprised by the positive results. I mean, one of the things that really struck me and I guess surprised me in terms of positivity was the statistics around what people thought of Jesus. I mean, apparently 20% of the UK believe that Jesus is God. And this is remarkable. 45% of the population believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And I think what struck me was that there's more belief in the resurrection among the younger generations than there is among the older generations. I mean, did those answers surprise you as well?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, whilst we still see that, I think it was 33% of people said that they didn't believe Jesus was God, thought he was a prophet, a good man, a leader, and so on. Yeah, if we take a step back and think 1 in 5 people in your friendship group, in mine, or families, or around our, in the workplace, 1 in 5 people, the 20%, as you said, would say that they believe that Jesus is God. Absolutely. And I suppose what it challenges me is to think with those people that we might say, yes, they believe that Jesus is God, but what else? It's a discipleship matter and conversation there, isn't it? What else do they know about God's big story, and how can that even open a conversation? Really encouragingly, like you said, 45% of the UK believe in the resurrection. I mean, whatever time of year we're at as individual Christians or as church leaders, we're always looking ahead both to Christmas or to Easter, aren't we? And I think that really challenges to make more of Easter as well. We make so much of Christmas, but again, where people would say that they believe in the resurrection, again, that opens up the wider conversation. So yes, this is the good news, isn't it? That, as we said, whether it's media, whether it's other factors, as Christians ourselves within the church, then I think it's a great challenge to us to actually recognise that people are really open, believing maybe in part, searching for other answers, and that gives us a great springboard for those conversations above, if you believe this, what do you think of all of this, that could be unpacked from the Bible, from our own faith journeys and so on. So very encouraging in terms of the UK landscape.
But slightly bizarre, though, that only 49% of 18 to 24s believe that Jesus actually existed.
Yeah, still, again, really interesting that we have this question around, do you believe that Jesus is a fictional character? And like you said, that comes out quite in quite a high percentage. So again, there's this real mix, isn't there, of actually not know. And again, as we know culturally, both with the young and the old, we can't assume much knowledge as to, the content from the Bible, what people's beliefs are. But if anything, hopefully it just encourages us to say that it's worth a conversation, not just going in there gung-ho straight for the jugular, just in doing life alongside people, whether there's belief, whether there isn't belief, then there's actually, people are very open to the conversation, at least, as long as we're respectful too of what their backdrop is and where they're coming from. And that comes in a later conversation as to what non-Christians recalled from some of the conversations that they've had with practicing Christians. So that's really interesting for us to note as well.
Well, yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that the Talking Jesus research suggests that I think it's only 53% of non-Christians in the UK know a practicing Christian. And that's dropped significantly. I think in 2015 it was 68% of non-Christians who knew a practicing Christian. Why do you think this number has dropped? And why is that significant, Rachael?
It's really significant for us, isn't it? And I think, to my mind, that's one of the big glaring alerts in this research. I mean, I think, as we said earlier, the piece of research is so helpful because it brings great encouragement. It also brings lots of challenge, which is good, because otherwise we'd think, as the UK church, we'd pat ourselves on the back and that we're doing a great job. But yes, this is a significant stat that, as you said, the drop over 7 years from 68% to 53% means that really, I guess, what we take from that is that as practicing Christians, as people, again, in our communities, in our families, wherever we find ourselves, we really do need to be making ourselves known. I don't know why some of that has come about. It may be that actually, as we've spoken to other leaders, it may be that actually looking at lockdown, we somewhat retreated, didn't we, into our boxes, into our houses. So again, during that time, there has been that element of retreating. However, having said that, during lockdown, as we know, the church was still incredibly fruitful, incredibly active. And all of those WhatsApp groups and so on that we had with our neighbours and our neighbourhoods actually still did mean that we had opportunities to connect. But what it does do is it gives us that challenge of, for individual Christians, how do we make ourselves known? How do we, in conversations, just, tell people about our Christian faith, the backdrop, our churchmanship or whatever, so that if they do want to have questions that go a bit deeper, then they know where to come. So I think that's the ongoing challenge for us, to see that number hopefully go back up, that more people will say in 5 years' time, when we hope to remap the research, that statistic will be different because people know us, that we're in close proximity to them.
Rachael, it really surprised me to read that apparently the more educated a person is, the more likely they are to know a practicing Christian. Do we have any idea why that is?
I think it's representative in part, and this is more anecdotal, but in part that as we look across a snapshot of our churches, we do often find that it is the black or white majority middle classes that are in our churches. There is a huge challenge there to us as to how we actually look across the demographic that our churches and our communities exist in, and say, how can we best reach people across all sectors of society so that the love of God, the truth of the gospel reaches them. But yes, that came through as a statistic, doesn't it? I know in part through my work at the EA, we have a wonderful team called the One People Commission, or OPC, who do a great job of encouraging each and every church across the UK, working with many others as well outside of the EA, but to almost be saying, look at the people who are in your catchment area, right on the doorstep of your church. How do we actually really engage with them in a way that it takes the gospel outside of our walls? And the challenge to our churches to actually be more reflective of the people that we're trying to reach. Because, of course, we know the gospel is for everyone, don't we? And as Christians, we hope we want all of those in our spheres of influence, in our communities, to come to know Jesus. But there is a challenge there as to how we really do that in a way that is impactful, that's reflective inside our churches as well, of the ethnic diversity and the beauty of kingdom expression that is outside of our walls. So, yeah, again, there's some challenge that the research flags up there, work in progress.
People largely seem to have a fairly positive perception of Christians, but they see the church in a slightly more negative light. I think 26% see it as hypocritical, 26% as narrow-minded. Why do you think there is, on the whole, a potentially negative view of the church? And do you think, obviously, crucially, can anything be done to change this perspective?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was really noteworthy that what came out of the research, as you just said, that people's perceptions of the church were overridingly much less favourable than when they spoke of the Christians that we know and that they know. So worth saying right from the outset, the encouraging bit before the challenge, which is, as you've said, when people were asked, if you know a practicing Christian, what would your reflection of them be as an individual? What came out was overridingly so positive. They think we're friendly, we're caring, we're generous, we're good humoured. Those are the top 4 answers. And any of the negatives come out much, much lower down. So that should really make us as individual Christians sit up and think, wow, this is great. They know us, they like us, we're in close proximity. It does, however, then beg the question, or rather the challenge to us as the church, if they think we're narrow-minded, we're hypocritical, actually, how do we combat that? Where's the work that we need to do around actually, acceptance, hospitality, bringing people in, so that hopefully, if as the church we're living as authentic lives without barriers, looking beyond ourselves, really showing people the love of God, then hopefully over time, actually some of those perspectives will change. But it's worth us acknowledging that for many outside the church, the threshold of them and what their perceptions of the church or even coming into church can be really anxiety inducing, fear inducing, and who knows again where some of those perceptions come from. But again, yes, very helpful for us to see this difference, the positive of what they see in us as individuals, but again, some work to do as the church to change some of those perceptions.
Rachael, as we come to the end of this show, I guess the obvious question is, why does all of this matter? And what are some of the key insights that we can be taking from this research that we've looked at, I guess specifically about the UK's beliefs when it comes to God and Christians and Christianity and church?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so much we could glean from this research, and again, just how we look at the cultural context and how the church can be proactive across the UK. But I think, Ruth, I would say, in summing up some of what we've been talking about, is that actually, as we look at the world outside of the church, we see that actually, whilst of course some may have no interest in faith, a great many people will have those big questions, will be searching. And against this difficult landscape, like we said, the unsettled nature, the pain, the trauma, the turmoil, you'll know it amongst your friends. I certainly see it in my friends' lives as well. That actually, I think the challenge and the encouragement to us as Christians would be, we need to just get out there more, to be making ourselves known as people of God, to be loving our friends, to be in genuine, fun-filled, that fullness of life relationship alongside them, but really prayerful too, recognition of all that they're going through and being honest and vulnerable at times about what we go through as well as Christians. Our lives are never promised to be perfect, aren't they? And sometimes messy. And yet into the midst of that, where people are asking, as we're told, will everything be okay? Well, it may not be that everything will be okay, but as Christians, we know, don't we, that we have the light and truth and hope that is promised to us through the gospel. So I think my challenge to myself, as much as anybody else, is how do we make ourselves known? How do we live alongside in close proximity to people and really live it out, not with that big old monologue of having to tell it all, but an authentic life on life, everyday witness, so that people will truly come to know Jesus just in those small nuggets, but God can just uplift that, use it and draw people to himself against this backdrop, as indeed amongst many of ages gone by. So there's lots of hope, but lots of challenge for us as well.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.